Invincible is everything the modern MCU isn't. After an incredibly strong season 1 that set the ball rolling, the new season hasn't been putting any punches either. Its bold and fresh take on the genre, along with its incredible writing and twists, have made it an instant classic. When you compare it to what the MCU has been pumping out recently, the difference in quality is clear. Flop after flop after flop has proven they just can't learn their lesson, and if it keeps on carrying like this, Invincible is going to destroy the MCU. Watching DC and Marvel films alone would make you think that the superhero genre is on its last legs. The same stories over and over again with awful characters and even worse writing is getting to even the most hardcore of Marvel fans by now. So what's Invincible done differently? On the surface, Invincible might look like any other superhero property. Tons of the characters are clearly borrowed versions of other famous heroes. Omni-Man is clearly inspired by Superman. Darkwing is a counterpart to Batman. Monster Girl and her transformation power is obviously drawing from the Hulk. Along with the characters, the world is clearly drawing from superhero tropes as well. Cecil and the Global Defense Agency fill in for the shadowy government agency putting the strings from behind the scenes. All the heroes have their own secret identities as well. If you can name a superhero trope, it's probably in there. The difference comes with what Invincible and its writers have actually done with these archetypes and characters. All the ingredients for a light-hearted fun comic book show are there, and the first episode makes you think that's all it's going to be, with its cheerful version of the Justice League facing off against two cartoonishly simple and outmatched villains. That is until its infamous ending. Mixed R-rated violence and colourful comic book superheroes isn't completely unique, but the execution is incredible. The final scene from episode 1 is a masterclass in how to shock the audience and give weight to what's happening. The music is also particularly impressive, starting out in usual Marvel fashion with an ominous orchestral swell. As the fight continues, it keeps building just as expected. But once Omni-Man makes the first kill, it completely cuts out, leaving the audience alone as the carnage unfolds. It's this scene that illuminates one of Invincible's greatest strengths, and something that's clearly missing from the modern MCU: unpredictability and actual stakes. It shows the audience that nobody's safe. Characters which are introduced as the top heroes of the world get dispatched one by one. While it's obviously animated and cartoonish, the violence is realistic in its speed and its impact. It tells us that anyone could go at any time. Nobody is safe and real. Tangible danger is always around the corner, and the whole show keeps this tension going expertly. An often underrated scene is when Omni-Man goes to see his tailor, Art. Without any overt threats or menace, the point comes through incredibly clearly. Omni-Man simply flicking the top of a beer bottle is all Omni-Man needs to demonstrate the fact that he could end Art's life in a split second. It stands in stark contrast to the post-Endgame MCU, where you already know pretty much everything that's going to happen before the movie even starts. The main characters will be safe at the end, they always win eventually. The fights will be visual spectacle, sure, but they never have the impact that Invincible can accomplish with just a few frames of animation. They're simply roller coasters. The ride might be fun the first few times, but MCU films always end up right back at the start, ready to make the same twists and turns all over again. It's a formula they've been milking for nearly 2 decades, but over that time, the characters like Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America that drew people in have nearly all gone. In their stead is a collection of former side characters who, despite their actors' best efforts, just don't cut it as a main attraction. That, or they use movies to try and force through a political message. Before, when the MCU still packed a punch, these were nuanced discussions. The Russo brothers and their 2 Captain America movies had these layers. The Winter Soldier and Civil War was a story about Captain America defeating a shadowy organization and facing his past. Underneath that though, there was a real discussion about government and the middle ground between safety and control. How much freedom do you trade away for that? And how can you trust those in power to know the responsibility that comes with that? These were the questions the movie was posing. Sure, you might be able to trust a perfect person to operate without rules for the good of everyone, but even Captain America wasn't perfect, and the Avengers Authority was in conflict with the actual rules that everyone else lives by. People still disagree about whether Iron Man was right or if Captain America was justified, but as the MCU progressed, these discussions melted away, replaced by what boardroom executives think the audience wants to see. At first, it was just a few scenes, like the infamous "she's got help" part from the final battle of Endgame.
Don't worry. She's got help.
It was ridiculous in its execution, getting pretty much every single female character to pose for the camera and wow the audience with their presence. This scene became the template for entire movies like the Marvels, which was completely predictably a failure. Instead of just owning their status as a popcorn film, or going deeper and actually trying to start a conversation, these movies rely on something else entirely: A mixture of identity politics, omnipotent strong female characters, and a world that changes to accommodate them rather than the other way round. The main hero starts out as the most competent, powerful people in their little world. The rest of the movie is just the other characters slowly coming to realize it. Watching Invincible only drives this point deeper, but not for the reason you might expect. When the first season released, barely anyone had anything bad to say about it. That was except for the character of Amber, Mark's girlfriend. Over the course of the show, they constantly drive it in that she's just the best person that's ever existed. Countless times they show her talking about or doing charity work.
Helping build schools. It was one of those group volunteer things.
Meanwhile, Mark is trying to balance his hero life with his normal life, and he constantly stands her up without telling her why. Amber's rightfully annoyed, and they go through the classic teenage romance drama because of it. Still, the entire world seems to think she's always right, despite the fact that she barely shows any sympathy when she's told Mark was hit by a bus. All of this comes to a head when everybody's attacked on a trip to a college. Mark runs off to change into Invincible, then he saves their lives. But to Amber, it just looks like he left them for dead. You can understand why she breaks up with him after that, not knowing the truth. The problem comes later when they reveal that she'd known he was a superhero for weeks. She still blamed him for not going out on dates with her, even when she knows that Mark is risking his life to save other people. Then after the finale, she just walks back into Mark's arms, like he was in the wrong the entire time. It's like they added a tiny bit of the modern MCU into Invincible, and their treatment of her character is one of the only criticisms you can really level at the show. But what we've seen of season 2 so far gives us a reason to keep hoping. Clearly, the writers listened to the feedback they got and did some rethinking, as her character completely changes. She accepts Mark's responsibilities, and they outweigh her own needs. She's supportive and kind, a complete reversal of her antics in season 1. It might have been a little more satisfying to see Mark actually confront her and stand up for himself, but it's not a huge issue. And it shows that the writers and the showrunners are willing to listen to the fans and the audience. They know that they messed up her character before, and there are scenes that seem like they're specifically meant to fix those issues. It's completely the opposite of what the MCU has been doing. Time and time again, they've been making the same sorts of inconsistent, poorly written movies, appealing to an audience that just doesn't exist outside of the minds of executives. There are some forces outside of their control working against them, of course. Invincible's production timeline is much shorter than your average $300 million Marvel production. There's years in between the script getting written and the final film actually coming out. They might know now that diversity fodder and pandering films aren't really working anymore, but it won't change the films they've pretty much made already. Even with this incredibly generous view of it all though, they're still obviously forcing something that anyone should know doesn't work. The 2016 Ghostbusters remake should have been all the information they need to know that gender swapping the characters, throwing in some girl power scenes, and releasing the film isn't enough to make people like it.
Ghostbusters 2016 was quite literally the perfect storm of everything that people hate about modern Hollywood.
It looks embarrassing when you compare it to the original that was made 30 years ago, and that still holds up. The effects in that movie are still amazing after all this time.
The fact that they're still doing it nearly a decade later shows how out of touch the MCU, Disney, and their executives truly are. Invincible shows us how to write characters properly, not based on glorifying whatever checkbox their identity fits into, but actually treating them like a real person. A perfect example is Debbie, Omni-Man's wife and Mark's son. One difference between her and cookie cutter strong female protagonist archetype is that she actually has agency. She's her own person with her own nuanced personality. When her doubts are raised, she investigates Nolan herself. She gets the truth herself, and then she's left to deal with the consequences. She's strong, but not in some better than every other single character way, but in a down-to-earth realistic way. Nolan might be one of the strongest people on the planet physically, but Debbie is clearly stronger emotionally. In the end, it overcomes Nolan's physical strength. Her impact on Mark is what saves the world, and when Nolan is trying to convince Mark to help him, it's his comment that she's like a pet that sets him over the edge and convinces him to resist. It's a perfect example of the kind of writing that just isn't present in the MCU anymore. It lays the foundations for dark and dramatic moments that aren't constantly being undercut by jokes. In fact, Invincible even cuts away from the action towards the end of the finale to add more character development, to set the stage for the internal conflict that's driving them. It's like the opposite of what the MCU would have done in a similar scene. The show even subtly makes fun of the way every superhero becomes a one-line comedian. In the MCU, these moments used to be a refreshing break, but now they're so common that they make it seem like nobody's taking anything seriously.
Now might be a really good time for you to get angry.
That's my secret, Cat. I'm always angry.
How is the audience meant to get invested in the big CGI fights when the characters aren't? Inserting that into Invincible would just be ridiculous. Like if Omni-Man made a pun about missing his stop during the train scene. Invincible proves that superhero fatigue isn't a real thing. In fact, people are as excited as ever to see more of these stories, but only if they're done right. The real issue with the MCU, and the reason everybody got tired of it, runs much deeper. Its success was its downfall. People got invested into the main characters, the main plotline, and the overarching arc with Thanos. It's like they're just trying to figure out where to go next. Iron Man Man, the hero who started it all, is gone now, as well as Captain America. Thor stayed on for a while, but he couldn't even carry his own Phase 4 film. The next big villain hasn't really come into it at all. They didn't need another Thanos, of course, but a reason to care about the movie outside of whatever contrived stakes they set up is key. The MCU is just confused now. It lost all the momentum that made Infinity War and Endgame such massive events. The motivation got drowned in a sea of mediocre spin-off shows, side characters, and simply poor movies. On top of all of that, each Marvel film used to stand on its own. Their connections with the rest of the MCU were subtle, sometimes completely relegated to the end credits scene. Now, watching a modern Marvel film feels like starting a movie 2/3 of the way through. They're so reliant on the other films for their reason to exist, whilst also not contributing to any actual overarching plot in a clear, noticeable way. The comics and the actual source material have ceased to matter entirely, replaced by whatever boardroom of executives decide will play well to focus groups. Invincible doesn't have this problem. The story is all set out, and it's gonna get crazy. Every scene and episode matters because it moves that story forward. The stakes in the universe seem real because the characters seem real. It's even going to do the multiverse angle better. Starting with Endgame, the multiverse becomes the ultimate cop-out for the writers. Instead of actually mattering for the plot, it's just a one-stop shop to fix the plot of a movie. Or it's just used to push in cameos from other superheroes that wouldn't fit otherwise. Cameos that don't just mean nothing, but actually undermine the characters themselves. For anyone who liked the Fantastic Four and Mr. Fantastic himself, his cameo in the Doctor Strange movie must have been so disappointing. He teleports in, gets called the smartest man alive, reveals his friend's powers, causing him to instantly die. Then he just dies as well. Scenes like that one that just destroy parts of the Marvel universe a dime a dozen now. Invincible doesn't have this problem though. It doesn't have to rely on cheap nostalgia and recognition to give weight to its stories. It obviously borrows tropes and archetypes from superhero comics, but it builds on them and turns them into something new. The first episode is a great example, as we see the status quo of the Justice League protecting the Earth from cartoonish villains. A world where the heroes and the villains fight. The heroes win, and then everything just goes back to normal. Then that all gets thrown on its head in one final scene. All the work the episode did in setting up those characters gets violently destroyed. We see the consequences every time something happens. The characters go through loss, regret, and every other emotion as the world changes around them. Even Omni-Man isn't impervious to it. When Mark gets his powers, he's distressed because it means he's run out of time. The world and the family he built are over now. He's caught between Viltrum and Earth. If Mark hadn't gotten his powers, he could have waited until his family had passed away, then gotten on with his mission. Instead, he's got to tear them apart. This focus on consequences and keeping one foot in reality is what sets Invincible apart and makes every fight and conversation matter so much more. Which other superhero show has so many scenes that take place in hospitals? Any characters could die, nobody is safe. Even Mark, despite being the main character and actually being called Invincible, is a punching bag more often than not. But each fight makes him learn another lesson and pushes his character forward towards a concrete conclusion. It isn't like the MCU, which is based around a sitcom style of storytelling. There's no constant cycle where every episode and plotline ends with everything going back to the way things were. Just as superhero comics progress towards this way of structuring a story, comic book films and shows are catching up as well. Superheroes aren't a dying breed like some people would think after seeing the MCU's collapse. Instead, the genre is changing and evolving into something better, with shows like Invincible and The Boys leading the way. Meanwhile, the MCU is shooting itself in the foot. It was expected that there would be some kind of drop-off after Endgame, without all the famous characters that built it all. But even then, the performance has been truly dismal. Every single aspect of the films has gotten worse. Special effects are even down the drain, just look at Thor: Love and Thunder. Despite working their VFX artists down to the bone for years on end, they've barely got anything to show for it. Sometimes artists were given just weeks to create a complete scene. A crazy task considering the whole movie is pretty much filmed on a green screen anyway. In the 2,700 shots that make up Infinity War, only 80 didn't have VFX in them. Like most of the problems with Marvel, it's a result of corporate greed on the part of Disney. Despite raking in untold billions from these movies, they're still understaffing artists and forcing them into permanent crunch time. As their films perform worse and worse, there will be even less money in the budget and the effects will only get worse. Then there's all the long shows that barely anyone watches. WandaVision, for example, had more VFX shots and work than the entirety of Endgame. Marvel keeps throwing more stuff at the wall, hoping it will stick, but every time they do, they just make the problem worse. Saving money by hiring amateur writers and directors isn't helping either. It's a problem that extends across the whole production, and it's been going on for years now, and it's pretty hopeless that we'll see a transition back towards quality anytime soon. The Boys and Invincible dodge this problem in different ways. The Boys places tons of emphasis on physical effects. Invincible is animated, so it's a completely different story. But they don't get bogged down in multiple movies, TV shows, and properties all coming out at once. When spin-offs do come out like Gen V or the Atom Eve episode, they only build on on previous success rather than taking away from it, and by focusing on quality over quantity, Invincible is showing people what this genre can really be. It's giving people a breath of fresh air and it's destroying the MCU.